My name is Ali, and I'm 27 years old. I never considered myself the type of person who'd stumble into the supernatural. In fact, until last year, I thought the scariest things I'd face in life were deadlines and parking tickets. That changed during a trip to a forest in northern Iran. A trip that turned into a waking nightmare I can't forget. It was autumn, and a group of friends had planned a weekend camping trip in the Alborz Mountains. These forests are famous for their beauty, with tall trees that seem to stretch into eternity. The air is crisp, and the ground is littered with a thick carpet of fallen leaves. I wasn't much of an outdoorsy type, but my best friend Reza had convinced me. "It'll be fun," he said, "a chance to get away from the chaos of Tehran." So there we were, 6 of us packed into 2 cars driving up winding mountain roads. The forest grew denser as we climbed, the sun dipping lower until the shadows stretched long and dark. We reached a secluded spot just before sunset, unloaded our gear, and set up camp. Everything seemed normal at first. We laughed, cooked kebabs over the fire, and shared ghost stories to pass the time. It wasn't until the second night that things started to feel wrong. That evening, I decided to explore the forest a bit on my own. The others were busy playing cards, and I wanted some quiet time. With a flashlight in hand, I wandered into the trees, the beam cutting through the thick darkness. There was something oddly serene about being alone in the forest, but it didn't last long. About 10 minutes into my walk, I started hearing whispers. At first, I thought it was the wind rustling the leaves, but the sound grew clearer. It was faint, like someone murmuring just out of earshot. I stopped, my flashlight trembling in my hand. "Hello?" I called out, expecting one of my friends to jump out and scare me. No response. The whispers stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. Even the usual sounds of the forest, chirping crickets, the rustle of leaves, had vanished. My chest tightened as I realized how far I had wandered. Turning back, I quickened my pace, but the sense of being watched clung to me like a shadow. When I returned to the campfire, Reza noticed the look on my face. "You okay, man?" he asked. I shrugged it off, chalking it up to paranoia, but deep down I knew something wasn't right. Later that night, as we sat around the fire, something strange happened. Reza froze mid-sentence, his eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the camp. "Did you see that?" he whispered. We all turned to look. At first, I didn't notice anything. Then, just beyond the reach of the firelight, I saw her, a figure standing between the trees. She was dressed in white, her hair long and matted. She didn't move, didn't speak. She just stood there watching us. "Who's there?" one of my friends shouted, his voice shaky. The figure didn't respond. Instead, she took a slow, deliberate step closer. That was when we saw her face, or rather, the lack of it. Her features were smooth, blank, like a porcelain doll. Panic set in. Someone grabbed a stick from the fire and waved it in her direction, shouting threats. But the moment the light touched her, she vanished. We didn't sleep that night. None of us said it out loud, but we all knew we'd seen something unnatural. The next morning, we debated leaving, but Reza insisted on staying. "We probably just imagined it," he said, though his voice betrayed his fear. "Besides, it's daylight now. What could happen?" Reluctantly, we stayed, but the forest felt different. It was quieter, darker, as if the trees themselves were closing in on us. That evening, I decided to record the strange occurrences on my phone, hoping to make sense of them later. Around midnight, as we sat around the fire, I pulled out my phone and began filming. At first, nothing happened. Then the whispers started again, louder this time, like a chorus of voices surrounding us. Suddenly, the fire flickered and died, plunging us into darkness. My phone's flashlight was the only source of light, and in its glow, I saw her again. The woman in white. This time she was much closer, her blank face inches from mine. I screamed, stumbling backward. My friends shouted in confusion, but when they turned on their flashlights, she was gone. We decided to leave at first light, but the forest had other plans. Around 3 a.m., our tent started shaking violently, as if something or someone was trying to rip them apart. We scrambled out, huddling together with whatever makeshift weapons we could find. The whispers grew deafening, coming from every direction. Shadows darted between the trees, too fast to be human. And then we saw them. Figures emerging from the darkness, dozens of them, all dressed in white, their faces blank. We ran. I don't know how we managed to navigate the forest in the dark, but adrenaline took over. The figures didn't chase us outright, but they followed, their presence pressing in from all sides. When we finally reached our cars, the sun was beginning to rise. The figures stopped at the edge of the forest, watching as we sped away. It's been a year since that night, but I haven't gone camping since. None of us talk about what happened, though I know it haunts us all. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, convinced I can hear the whispers again. The forest took something from me that night, my sense of safety, my belief in the ordinary. And though I'll never set foot there again, I know it's still out there, waiting for its next visitors. My name is Kamal Yilmaz, and I am 38 years old. I never thought I'd be telling this story, but the events of that night still haunt me. It was a rainy evening in late November when I found myself trapped in one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. What I'm about to share is not fiction. It happened to me in the dense forests of northern Turkey, near the village of Ayvazlar. It started as an innocent plan to clear my mind. My wife and I had been going through some difficult times, and the weight of the arguments was suffocating. So when my childhood friend Selim suggested we take a weekend trip to a secluded cabin in the woods, I jumped at the opportunity. The cabin belonged to his uncle, who had passed away years ago. Selim claimed it was still in good condition and would be the perfect place to unwind. Little did I know that forest held secrets no one should ever uncover. We arrived in Ayvazlar late in the afternoon. The rain had started as a light drizzle but quickly turned into a relentless downpour. The air was heavy with the earthy scent of wet soil, and the village seemed almost deserted, as if its inhabitants knew better than to linger outside after dark. The cabin was about a 30-minute hike from the village, deep within the forest. Armed with flashlights, raincoats, and a bottle of raka, Selim and I set out. The trees were tall and gnarled, their branches intertwined like skeletal fingers, forming a canopy that barely allowed any light to filter through. The sound of rain hitting the leaves created an eerie rhythm, broken only by the occasional snap of a twig beneath our boots. The path grew narrower and muddier with each step, and an unsettling feeling began to creep over me. "Are you sure this is the right way?" I asked Selim, trying to mask the unease in my voice. He nodded confidently. "Of course, I've been here before. Relax, we're almost there." But the deeper we ventured, the less confident I felt. The trees seemed alive, their twisted forms casting sinister shadows in the dim glow of our flashlights. Then, just as we were about to lose hope of finding the cabin, it appeared, a small, weathered structure nestled among the trees. The sight of the cabin should have been a relief, but it wasn't. There was something off about it. The windows were dark, and the roof sagged under the weight of years. It looked as though it hadn't been touched in decades, not just years. We stepped inside, and the musty smell of damp wood and decay hit us immediately. The interior was sparse: a wooden table, a couple of chairs, and a fireplace. Selim lit a fire, and we sat down, trying to shake off the cold and damp. As the evening wore on, the unease I had felt earlier refused to fade. Selim, on the other hand, seemed perfectly at ease, sipping raka and recounting stories from our childhood. But then came the first sign that something was wrong. It started as a faint sound, barely audible over the crackling of the fire and the drumming of the rain. A whisper, low and unintelligible, drifting in from the forest. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Hear what?" Selim replied, looking at me like I was crazy. The whisper came again, louder this time. It sounded like a voice, but the words were distorted, as if spoken underwater. Selim laughed it off, saying it was probably the wind, but I wasn't convinced. Hours passed, and the rain showed no sign of stopping. Around midnight, Selim decided to call it a night and went to one of the bedrooms. I wasn't tired, so I stayed up, staring into the fire and listening to the storm outside. That's when I heard it, a knock at the door. It wasn't the kind of knock you'd expect from a lost traveler seeking shelter. It was slow and deliberate, each knock echoing through the cabin like a heartbeat. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. "Selim," I called out, my voice trembling. There was no response from the bedroom. The knocking continued. Gathering my courage, I approached the door. "Who's there?" I demanded, but no answer came. The knocking stopped, replaced by the sound of footsteps circling the cabin. My heart raced as I moved to the window, trying to see who or what was out there. But the darkness was impenetrable, and all I could make out were the shifting shadows of the trees. Then suddenly, the whispers returned, louder and clearer than before. They were coming from all around me, as if the forest itself was speaking. "Leave!" The voice was deep and guttural, sending a chill down my spine. I stumbled back, knocking over a chair in my panic. Selim burst out of the bedroom, looking annoyed. "What the hell are you doing?" he asked, rubbing his eyes. "Someone's outside," I stammered. "I heard them. They were knocking." Selim looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "There's no one out there, Kamal. It's just your imagination." But I knew what I had heard, and as the night wore on, the sounds only grew worse. The whispers turned into wails and the knocking returned, this time more frantic. At one point, I swear I saw a figure standing among the trees, a tall, shadowy form with glowing eyes. It didn't move, just stared at the cabin, its presence oppressive and menacing. By dawn, I was a wreck. Selim tried to convince me to stay another night, but I refused. Something was wrong with that place, and I wasn't going to stick around to find out what. As we hiked back to the village, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The forest seemed alive, its branches reaching out like claws, and the whispers followed us all the way back. When we finally reached Ivazlar, an old man approached us. He took one look at me and said, "You went to the cabin, didn't you?" I nodded, too shaken to speak. "You're lucky to be alive," he said gravely. "That place is cursed. Many who enter never return." I wanted to ask more, but Selim dragged me away, saying the old man was just trying to scare us. But deep down, I knew he was right. To this day, I don't know what we encountered in that forest. Was it a spirit, a demon, or something beyond human comprehension? All I know is that I'll never set foot in those woods again. And if you're ever in Ivazlar, heed my warning. Stay far away from the cabin, because some places are better left untouched. My name is John, and I'm 26 years old. Up until a year ago, I had never truly believed in the supernatural. I thought ghosts, monsters, and all those campfire tales were just things people made up to scare each other. But everything changed last summer when I took a trip to the Apache Sitgreaves National Forest in Arizona. What I experienced there still haunts my dreams, and no amount of reasoning or skepticism can erase the memory. It started as a simple idea, a solo camping trip to escape the chaos of city life. I had just been through a rough breakup, and I needed time to clear my head. The vast expanse of the Apache Sitgreaves National Forest seemed like the perfect place to reconnect with nature and find some peace. I arrived at the forest early in the morning, the sunlight streaming through the towering pines. The forest felt alive, its sounds and smells filling my senses. Birds chirped overhead, and the rustling of leaves in the breeze was soothing. I parked my car at the trailhead, slung my backpack over my shoulder, and began my hike into the wilderness. For the first few hours, everything was perfect. The trail was well marked, and I passed a few other hikers along the way. Everyone seemed friendly, offering smiles and nods as they passed. By mid-afternoon, I found a secluded spot near a small clearing, far enough from the main trail to feel isolated but close enough that I could find my way back easily. I set up my tent, gathered firewood, and cooked a simple meal. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest transformed. The vibrant greens and browns of the day turned to deep shadows, and the once inviting trees seemed to close in around me. The air grew colder, and an uneasy feeling settled in my chest. I brushed it off as nerves. This was my first solo camping trip after all. By the time darkness fell, the forest was eerily silent. The chirping of birds and the rustling of leaves had ceased, replaced by an oppressive stillness. Even the wind seemed to have disappeared. I tried to distract myself by stargazing, marveling at the brilliance of the night sky. But the sense of unease lingered, like an invisible weight pressing down on me. Around midnight, I was startled awake by a noise outside my tent. It was faint at first, like soft footsteps crunching on the forest floor. My heart began to race as I strained to listen. The footsteps grew louder, circling my campsite. I told myself it was probably an animal, a deer or maybe a raccoon, but the rhythm of the steps was unsettlingly human. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent slowly, trying to make as little noise as possible. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but trees and shadows. The footsteps stopped abruptly, as if whoever or whatever it was knew I was watching. My breath caught in my throat as I scanned the area, the silence now deafening. Then I saw it, a figure standing just beyond the edge of my campsite, partially obscured by the trees. It was tall and thin, its silhouette unnaturally angular. The flashlight's beam flickered as I tried to focus on it, and for a moment I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. But the figure didn't move. It just stood there staring, or at least I thought it was staring. I couldn't see its face. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. No response. The figure remained motionless. I grabbed the hatchet from my backpack, clutching it tightly as I stepped closer. My legs felt like lead, but I forced myself to move. As I approached, the figure seemed to dissolve into the shadows, vanishing before my eyes. I froze, my mind racing to make sense of what I had just seen. Was it a trick of the light? A hallucination? I backed away slowly, my heart pounding, and retreated to my tent, zipping it up tightly. Sleep was out of the question. I sat there in the dark, gripping the hatchet and listening for any sound. The footsteps returned around 3 a.m., louder and more deliberate this time. They circled the tent, closer than before. I could hear heavy breathing, low and guttural, just outside. I held my breath, praying it would go away. Suddenly, the tent's fabric began to ripple, as if something was dragging its fingers across it. I wanted to scream, but fear paralyzed me. And then it spoke. A raspy, inhuman voice whispered my name. "John!" I bolted out of the tent, flashlight and hatchet in hand. The clearing was empty, but the sense of being watched was overwhelming. I didn't wait to find out what was out there. I grabbed my backpack and ran, leaving the tent and most of my gear behind. The forest seemed different in the darkness. The trail I had followed earlier was barely visible, and the trees felt closer, almost suffocating. I stumbled and fell multiple times, my flashlight barely illuminating the path ahead. The whispering followed me, growing louder and more insistent. "John, come back!" I finally reached the trailhead as dawn broke, the first rays of sunlight piercing through the trees. I collapsed next to my car, gasping for air. The forest was silent again, as if nothing had happened. I didn't look back as I drove away, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. I reported the incident to the park rangers, but they dismissed it as an overactive imagination or a bad dream. They said there were no reports of strange activity in the area. But I know what I saw, what I heard. Something is out there in the Apache Sitgreaves National Forest, something that doesn't belong in this world. I haven't been back since, and I never will. The memories of that night still haunt me, and sometimes in the dead of night, I hear the whispering again.